The early morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Matthews' perfectly maintained front lawn as he slowly made his way to his cherished garden. At 93 years old, his movements were deliberate but determined, much like the soldier he once was. His weathered hands gripped his wooden cane, a constant companion these days, though he refused to let age stop him from his daily routines. Every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., Harold would emerge from his small but well-kept suburban home on Sadar Street. The neighbors had grown used to seeing the elderly veteran in his faded blue cardigan and pressed khaki pants, moving carefully among his beloved roses and tomato plants. Even in his advanced age, Harold maintained the military precision that had been instilled in him during World War II. Mrs. Thompson, who lived next door, often watched through her kitchen window as Harold worked in his garden. She remembered how different things had been 5 years ago when Harold's wife, Eleanor, was still alive. The couple had been inseparable for 67 years, tending to their garden together and sharing morning coffee on their small front porch. Since Eleanor's passing, Harold had lived alone, but he kept their home exactly as she had loved it. The old veteran had a simple but structured daily routine that he followed without fail. After his morning gardening, he would carefully raise the American flag on the tall pole in his front yard, a ritual he performed with the same respect and precision he had learned during his military service. The flagpole had become somewhat of a neighborhood landmark, standing proud and straight, just like its owner. Harold's house itself told a story of a life well lived. The white paint was always fresh, the windows sparkled clean, and the brass door knocker shone brightly in the sunlight. Inside, photographs of his military service hung alongside pictures of his 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. His Purple Heart and other military medals were displayed in a simple wooden case in the living room, though he rarely spoke about them. The neighborhood children found Harold fascinating. He always had butterscotch candies in his pockets, just like Eleanor used to carry, and he would share them while telling gentle stories about his childhood on a farm in Nebraska. He never mentioned the war to the children, saving those memories for the occasional visits from fellow veterans or for the quiet moments when he sat alone on his porch, watching the world go by. One particular morning, as Harold went about his usual routine, he noticed some unusual activity across the street. Workers were renovating the old Johnson's auto repair shop, which had been empty for nearly 2 years. The sound of power tools and construction equipment filled the usually peaceful morning air. Harold watched with mild interest as new signs were being installed, though he couldn't quite make out what they said from his position. Later that day, while Harold sat in his favorite armchair reading the morning newspaper, his grandson Tommy called. They spoke briefly about Tommy's college studies and his upcoming visit that weekend. Harold mentioned the construction across the street, and Tommy promised to help him figure out what kind of business was moving in when he came to visit. As evening approached, Harold followed another part of his daily ritual. He carefully lowered the American flag, folding it with practiced precision into the traditional triangle shape. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on as he stepped back inside his house, closing the door on another peaceful day. What Harold didn't know was that this would be one of the last quiet days he would enjoy for quite some time. The new business across the street would soon bring changes to his peaceful neighborhood, changes that would test the old veteran's patience, resilience, and ultimately lead to an unexpected turn of events that nobody could have predicted. As he settled into his evening routine, a simple dinner of soup and bread, followed by watching the evening news, Harold Matthews had no idea that his quiet life was about to become the talk of the entire town. But for now, he simply enjoyed the peace of his home, surrounded by memories of Eleanor and the life they had built together, unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. The weekend brought Tommy's visit, and with it came the answer to what was happening across the street. Harold and his grandson stood on the front porch, watching as a large sign was mounted on the newly painted building, Road Warriors Motorcycle Club. Tommy noticed how his grandfather's shoulders stiffened slightly at the sight, though Harold said nothing. By Monday morning, the quiet neighborhood had changed completely. The rumble of motorcycles filled the air as members of the club began to arrive. Harold watched from his garden as leather-clad riders parked their bikes in the newly striped parking lot. The peaceful morning air that once carried the sound of chirping birds was now filled with the roar of engines and loud rock music from the clubhouse. At first, Harold tried to adapt to the changes. He had lived through a world war, after all, and believed he could handle a little noise. But as the days passed, the situation grew worse. The bikers seemed to have little respect for the neighborhood's quiet atmosphere. They would gather late into the night, their laughter and motorcycle engines echoing through the streets until the early hours of the morning. Mrs. Thompson noticed how Harold now spent less time in his garden. The noise made it difficult for him to enjoy his peaceful morning routine. She watched as he struggled to steady his hands while tending to his roses, the constant rumble of motorcycles making his daily tasks more challenging. Yet, being the proud man he was, Harold refused to complain openly about the situation. One Tuesday afternoon, Harold was trying to back his old Buick out of his driveway when he discovered it blocked by 3 motorcycles. He carefully got out of his car, leaning heavily on his cane, and made his way across the street to the clubhouse. Inside, he found a group of younger men playing pool and drinking beer. The music was so loud that Harold had to raise his voice to be heard. "Excuse me," he said politely, "but I wonder if someone could move the motorcycles blocking my driveway." A tall man with tattoos covering his arms looked up from the pool table. "Oh, look who it is. Grandpa's come to visit," he said, causing several others to laugh. Another man, wearing a leather vest covered in patches, stepped forward. "What's the matter, old-timer? Past your bedtime already?" Harold stood straight, his military bearing evident despite his age. "I simply need to get my car out," he explained calmly. "I have a doctor's appointment." The men exchanged amused glances. "Sure thing, Hops," the tattooed man said, taking his time to finish his shot at the pool table before slowly making his way outside. Instead of moving the bikes, however, he started his motorcycle and revved the engine repeatedly, the sound echoing off the buildings. More laughter erupted from the clubhouse. As Harold made his way back across the street, he could hear one of them mockingly calling out, "Better hurry up, Gramps, before you break a hip." The laughter followed him all the way to his front door. That evening, as Harold sat in his favorite chair, he looked at the military photos on his wall. The young soldier in those black and white images had faced far worse challenges than this. Yet, the disrespect shown by these young men stirred something inside him that he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Harold noticed empty beer bottles in his garden and cigarette butts scattered across his perfectly maintained lawn. His flagpole, which had stood proud for decades, had motorcycle oil splattered at its base. As he cleaned up the mess, several bikes roared past, their riders purposely revving their engines as they passed his house. Mrs. Thompson, watching from her window, saw something change in her elderly neighbor's expression. The usual gentle look in Harold's eyes was replaced by a determination she hadn't seen before. She didn't know it then, but the quiet, kind-hearted veteran was reaching his limit. The man who had stormed the beaches of Normandy was not going to let a group of disrespectful bikers drive him from his home. As Harold finished cleaning his garden, his mind was already forming a plan. These young men clearly needed a lesson in respect, and Harold Matthews, despite his age, was just the man to teach it to them. The situation with the motorcycle club grew worse with each passing day. Harold's peaceful neighborhood had turned into what felt like a constant party zone. The local police had been called several times by different neighbors, but the bikers always seemed to know when the officers were coming. They would quiet down just long enough for the police to leave, then resume their disruptive behavior. One morning, as Harold walked to his mailbox, 3 motorcycles roared past him so closely that the wind from their passing nearly knocked him off balance. He caught himself on the mailbox post, his heart racing from the near fall. From the clubhouse across the street, he could hear laughing. These weren't just random incidents anymore, they were deliberate acts of intimidation. Mrs. Thompson and several other neighbors had offered to let Harold stay with them until something could be done about the bikers, but he politely refused each time. "I didn't survive Normandy to be chased out of my own home," he told them quietly, though the worry in their eyes touched him deeply. The neighborhood children who used to visit Harold for stories and butterscotch candies now stayed away, frightened by the loud motorcycles and rough-looking men. Harold missed their innocent questions and bright smiles. His front porch, once a gathering place for young and old alike, stood empty except for his solitary figure. Tommy visited more frequently now, concerned about his grandfather. During one visit, he found Harold sitting in his garden, staring at his damaged roses. Several motorcycles had been parked on the edge of his lawn, their kickstands leaving deep impressions in his carefully tended flower beds. The old veteran's hands trembled slightly as he tried to save what was left of his beloved flowers. "Grandpa, let me call the police again," Tommy suggested, kneeling beside Harold's garden chair. Or maybe we could talk to a lawyer. Harold shook his head slowly. The police have their hands full, and lawyers take too long, he replied, his voice firm despite his age. Sometimes a man has to handle things his own way. That afternoon, the bikers seemed especially rowdy. They had set up speakers outside the clubhouse, and the music was so loud that Harold's windows vibrated. As he watched from his living room, he saw several club members drinking in their parking lot, deliberately tossing their empty cans onto his property. The final straw came when Harold overheard two of the younger bikers making plans to remove his flagpole. "That stupid flag blocks the view of our sign," one said, laughing. "Maybe it'll just fall down one night." Something changed in Harold's eyes at that moment. The gentle, patient expression he usually wore was replaced by the determined look of the soldier he had once been. He walked to his bedroom and opened his closet, pushing aside his everyday clothes to reach a garment bag he hadn't touched in years. Inside was his old military uniform. Though aged, it had been perfectly preserved, just like the memories of his service. Harold ran his fingers over the medals and ribbons still pinned to the chest. Each one told a story of courage, sacrifice, and duty, values these young troublemakers seemed to know nothing about. That evening, as Harold ate his dinner at his small kitchen table, he could hear the bikers outside planning some kind of big gathering for the weekend. Their voices carried through his open window, boasting about how many people they would bring and how wild the party would be. Mrs. Thompson, bringing over a freshly baked pie as an excuse to check on him, found Harold studying old photographs spread across his dining room table. They weren't his usual family photos, but rather pictures from his military service. In them, a young Harold stood proud in his uniform, surrounded by his fellow soldiers. "Are you all right, Harold?" she asked, concerned by the intense look on his face. Harold looked up from the photographs, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. It wasn't his usual gentle smile, but one that suggested he had made an important decision. "Yes, Martha, I'm just fine," he said quietly. "In fact, I think it's time these boys learned a little something about respect." As Mrs. Thompson left, she glanced back to see Harold reaching for his telephone. Though she couldn't hear his conversation, she saw him writing down several names and numbers. The old veteran had a plan, and something told her the motorcycle club was about to learn why you don't underestimate a World War II veteran, no matter how old he might be. The weekend arrived with the roar of dozens of motorcycles descending upon the Road Warriors Motorcycle Club. Just as they had promised, this was their biggest gathering yet. By sunset, the parking lot was overflowing with bikes, forcing many riders to park along both sides of the street. The music was deafening, and the crowd of leather-clad bikers spilled out onto the sidewalks. Harold stood at his window, watching the chaos unfold. He had spent the afternoon installing a small security camera above his porch, a gift from Tommy, who was increasingly worried about his grandfather's safety. The old veteran hadn't told his grandson about his plans yet, knowing Tommy would try to talk him out of them. Around midnight, when the party was at its peak, Harold noticed three familiar figures approaching his property. Even in the dim street light, he recognized them as the same bikers who had been causing him the most trouble. They were stumbling slightly, clearly drunk, and laughing among themselves. Harold's security camera silently recorded as they made their way across his lawn. The first man kicked over Harold's garden lights, while another started pulling up the carefully tended flowers. But it was the third man's actions that made Harold's blood run cold. The biker approached the flagpole, the very symbol of everything Harold had fought for, and began loosening the mounting bolts at its base. "Hey, old-timer," one of them shouted, knowing Harold must be watching. "Think your precious flagpole needs some redecorating." Harold watched through his window as they rocked the pole back and forth, their laughter carrying through the night air. With a final push and the screech of tearing metal, the flagpole crashed to the ground. The American flag, which Harold had proudly raised and lowered each day for decades, lay crumpled in the dirt. For a long moment, Harold stood perfectly still. In his mind, he wasn't seeing three drunk bikers. He was seeing something far more personal. That flag had been with him since his retirement from the military. He had promised Eleanor he would always keep it flying. Every morning, raising that flag had been his way of honoring his fallen comrades, the ones who never made it back from the war. With hands that were surprisingly steady, Harold reached for his phone, but he didn't call the police. Instead, he dialed a number he had written down days ago, one that would set his plan in motion. As he waited for an answer, he walked to his closet and took out his uniform again. The next morning dawned quiet, unusually quiet. The bikers had finally passed out or gone home around 3 a.m., leaving behind a trail of destruction. Harold's garden was ruined. His flagpole lay broken, and empty bottles littered his lawn. But it was the security camera footage that proved most valuable. Mrs. Thompson came over early, horrified by the destruction she saw. She found Harold sitting calmly at his kitchen table, still in his pajamas and robe, drinking his morning coffee as if nothing had happened. "Oh, Harold," she gasped. "Have you called the police? This is terrible. Those thugs have gone too far." Harold set down his coffee cup carefully. "No, Martha," he said, his voice carrying a strength she hadn't heard in years. "I haven't called the police. I've called someone else. Several someone else's, actually." He stood up slowly, making his way to the window. Outside, the motorcycle club members were beginning to stir, nursing their hangovers in the morning sun. They were laughing about their nighttime adventures, unaware that their actions had been caught on camera. "You know, Martha," Harold said quietly, "these young men seem to have forgotten something important. They'd forgotten that respect isn't given, it's earned, and sometimes it needs to be taught the hard way." Mrs. Thompson watched as Harold walked to his bedroom, his steps purposeful despite his age. Through the partially open door, she could see him taking out his pressed military uniform, the medals catching the morning light. "Harold," she called out, worried, "what are you planning to do?" His answer came back calm and clear. "I'm going to teach them why you don't disrespect a flag that brave men died for. And more importantly, I'm going to show them what real warriors look like." While the bikers nursed their hangovers across the street, Harold Matthews was already hard at work in his study. His old military training had taught him that knowledge was the best weapon, and he intended to use it. Tommy had shown him how to use the internet during his last visit, and now the elderly veteran sat at his computer, carefully typing with 2 fingers. What Harold discovered over the next few hours surprised even him. The Road Warriors Motorcycle Club wasn't just any group of troublemakers. They were operating without proper permits. Their building violations alone filled 2 pages of Harold's carefully written notes. More importantly, their noise levels far exceeded the local ordinances, something he confirmed using a decibel meter app Tommy had installed on his phone. But the most interesting discovery came when Harold started researching the club's members themselves. Using social media and local veterans groups' websites, he found something fascinating. Mike "Tank" Thompson, the club's president, had served in Desert Storm. Several other members were veterans too, mainly from Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, Harold muttered to himself, jotting down more notes. "Seems these boys forgot where they came from." Around noon, Tommy arrived, worried about his grandfather after the previous night's events. He found Harold surrounded by papers, the security camera footage playing on his computer screen. "Grandpa, what is all this?" Tommy asked, picking up one of the many notes scattered across the desk. Harold smiled, a glimmer of his old military strategist days showing in his eyes. "Research, son. Every battle needs proper intelligence." He pointed to the screen where the footage clearly showed the 3 bikers vandalizing his property. "And evidence." Tommy sat down, concerned. "Are you taking this to the police?" "No," Harold replied, reaching for a dusty photo album. "I'm taking it to someone with more authority." He opened the album to reveal photographs from his military days, specifically one showing a much younger Harold receiving a medal from a general. "Remember General Martinez?" Harold asked. "He's retired now, but his son is the current commander at Fort Bradley. I served with both of them." He tapped another piece of paper. "And it just so happens that Fort Bradley runs the largest veterans support program in the state." As Harold explained his plan, Tommy's eyes widened. His grandfather wasn't just fighting back. He was orchestrating a masterful strategy that would hit the bikers where they least expected it. That afternoon, Harold made several phone calls. The first was to General Martinez Jr. at Fort Bradley. The conversation was brief but productive. The second call was to his old friend Judge Williams, who still served on the city council. The third was to the local Veterans Affairs office. Mrs. Thompson, bringing over a late lunch, found Harold dressed in his best suit, organizing papers into a folder. "Harold Matthews," she said, setting down the sandwich plate. "What are you up to?" Harold looked up, his eyes twinkling. Martha, did you know that building across the street sits on land zoned for community service organizations, and that their current operation violates at least 7 different city codes? He showed her another document. More importantly, did you know that several of those young men are veterans themselves? They've forgotten what that means. But tomorrow, he paused, patting the folder, tomorrow, I'm going to help them remember. As evening approached, Harold stood at his window watching the bikers across the street. They were quieter today, probably still recovering from their party. Little did they know that the old veteran they had been tormenting had spent the day building a case that would change everything. Tommy tried one last time to talk his grandfather out of whatever he was planning. Are you sure about this, Grandpa? These guys could be dangerous. Harold turned from the window, his posture straight despite his age. Tommy, let me tell you something about danger, he said quietly. I faced real danger, on the beaches of Normandy, in the forests of France. These boys? He shook his head. They're just lost. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is help someone find their way back. As the sun set, Harold laid out his uniform for the next morning. Tomorrow, he would walk into that clubhouse not as a frightened old man, but as a decorated veteran with a plan to teach these young men about true brotherhood, respect, and honor, lessons they seemed to have forgotten along the way. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear. Harold Matthews stood before his mirror, carefully adjusting his military uniform. Each medal and ribbon sat perfectly in place, just as they had decades ago. His hands moved slowly, but surely as he straightened his tie and brushed invisible dust from his shoulders. The uniform was a bit looser than it had been in his younger days, but it still commanded respect. At precisely 10 a.m., when the motorcycle club members usually began arriving for their Sunday gathering, Harold picked up his folder of documents and his cane. Mrs. Thompson and several other neighbors watched from their windows as the elderly veteran made his way across the street, walking with purpose despite his age. The clubhouse was already filling up with bikers. Music played from inside, though not as loudly as usual. Many were still recovering from Friday night's party. As Harold pushed open the heavy door, conversation stopped mid-sentence. The sight of a 93-year-old man in a full military dress uniform was enough to catch everyone's attention. Well, look who's here, sneered one of the men who had damaged Harold's flagpole. Grandpa's plain dress-up. A few others laughed. Their laughter died quickly as Harold walked further into the room. In the bright overhead lights, his medals gleamed. 2 purple hearts, a silver star, the Distinguished Service Cross. Each one told a story of courage and sacrifice that even these hardened bikers couldn't ignore. Harold's back was straight, his chin high, as he made his way to the center of the room. I'm looking for Mike Thompson, Harold said, his voice clear and strong. The one they call Tank. A large man with a graying beard stepped forward. He wore a leather vest covered in patches, including one that caught Harold's eye, a combat service ribbon from Desert Storm. I'm Tank, the man said, his voice gruff but curious. What do you want, old-timer? Harold reached into his folder and pulled out an old photograph. First, I want to show you something. He handed the photo to Tank. It showed a young Harold Matthews standing with his unit on the beaches of Normandy, just days after D-Day. That's Echo Company, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division, Harold said quietly. The room had gone completely silent now. We landed on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. I was 20 years old. Tank's expression changed as he studied the photograph. His eyes moved from the picture to the unit patches on Harold's uniform, then to the medals on his chest. Sir, Tank said, his voice different now, respectful. You were at D-Day. Harold nodded. I was, and now I'm here because I see fellow veterans who have forgotten something important. He looked around the room, making eye contact with several members. I've done my homework. I know many of you served. Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. He pulled out more papers from his folder. I also know about the building code violations, the noise ordinances you're breaking, and the fact that this property is zoned for community service organizations. Several members shifted uncomfortably, but Harold held up his hand. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to remind you of who you are. He turned to Tank. You wore the uniform. You know what it means to serve, to protect, to respect. Harold's voice grew stronger. 3 nights ago, some of your members tore down my flagpole, a flag I've raised every morning in memory of the men I served with who never came home. Men who died so we could all be free to live as we choose. The 3 responsible members tried to shrink into the background, but Tank's sharp look found them. The club president's face had turned red with anger, not at Harold, but at his own members. But I'm not here for revenge, Harold continued. I'm here to offer you a choice. You can either face the consequences of your actions. He patted his folder, or you can remember who you are. Veterans. Brothers. Men of honor. Tank stepped forward, towering over Harold, but his posture was one of respect now. Sir, he said, I think it's time we had a real conversation. He turned to his members. All of you, in the meeting room, now. As the bikers filed into the back room, Harold noticed something important. Not a single one of them was laughing anymore. In fact, many of them couldn't even meet his eyes. The old veteran had achieved his first victory. He had their attention. Now it was time for the real work to begin. Inside the motorcycle club's meeting room, the atmosphere had changed completely. The usual rowdy behavior was replaced by respectful silence as Harold Matthews sat at the head of the long table, with Tank beside him. Old photographs and documents lay spread across the table's surface. Let me tell you about Jim Cooper, Harold said, pointing to a young soldier in one of the D-Day photos. He was 19 when this picture was taken. 2 days later, he died saving 3 of our men. His finger moved to another face, and this was Frank Martinez. He gave me his last bandage on the beach, then took a bullet meant for our lieutenant. Tank and his fellow veterans leaned forward, drawn in by Harold's stories. The 3 members who had vandalized Harold's property sat in the back, heads bowed in shame. One of them, a younger man named Steve, had tears in his eyes. Sir, Tank said, his voice heavy with emotion, I had no idea who you were. None of us did. We dishonored everything we stand for. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. Those responsible for damaging your property and flag will make it right. Today. Steve stepped forward, his voice shaken. Mr. Matthews, I'm the one who took down your flagpole. He swallowed hard. My brother died in Afghanistan. I have a flag too, at home. I don't know what I was thinking. Harold looked at the young man, seeing not a troublemaker, but a lost soul. Grief can make us do foolish things, son, he said gently. The question is, what do we do to make things right? Tank called forward 2 other members, both construction workers in their civilian lives. You 2 will rebuild Mr. Matthews' flagpole, make it stronger than before. He turned to the rest of the club. And all of you will help clean up his garden. We're going to fix everything we destroyed. But Harold wasn't finished. He opened his folder and pulled out more papers. I've spoken with General Martinez Jr. at Fort Bradley, he said. He runs the largest veterans support program in the state. They need local organizations to help veterans transition back to civilian life. Tank's eyes widened as he understood what Harold was suggesting. You want us to? Your club is already set up as a community organization, according to the zoning laws, Harold explained. Why not make it official? Become a real veterans support group. Keep the motorcycles, keep the brotherhood, but add a purpose. The room buzzed with conversation as the idea took hold. Many of the members had struggled with their own transitions from military to civilian life. They knew firsthand how hard it could be. We could mentor younger vets, one member suggested. Organize rides for PTSD awareness, another added. Help with job training and placement, a third called out. Tank stood up again, this time addressing his entire club. Mr. Matthews didn't come here to shut us down, even though he could have. He came here to remind us of who we are. He looked around the room. We're veterans first. It's time we started acting like it. As the meeting continued, plans were made and responsibilities assigned. The club would partner with Fort Bradley's Veterans Program. They would organize support groups and community service projects. The wild parties would be replaced with purposeful gatherings. Harold sat back, watching as these men transformed before his eyes from troublemakers into leaders. Mrs. Thompson, who had been worried sick about him, would never believe it if she hadn't seen Tommy's video of the entire meeting. By late afternoon, Harold's garden had been restored, with new flowers planted and the lawn carefully tended. A crew was already working on installing a new, taller flagpole. but more importantly, a bridge had been built between generations of veterans. As Harold prepared to leave, Tank stopped him at the door. "Sir, would you? Would you consider becoming our honorary president? We could use your wisdom." Harold looked at the man, no longer seeing an intimidating biker, but a fellow soldier. "On one condition," he said with a small smile. "You keep the music down after 8 o'clock. I'm not as young as I used to be." The laughter that followed was different from the mocking sounds of before. It was the warm laughter of brotherhood, of understanding, of respect earned and given. The war between the old veteran and the motorcycle club was over, replaced by something far more valuable, a unity of purpose that would change not just their lives, but the lives of countless other veterans in their community. 6 months had passed since that fateful Sunday meeting, and Cedar Street was a different place entirely. The Road Warriors Motorcycle Club, now officially known as the Veterans Brotherhood Support Group, had become a source of pride for the entire neighborhood. Every morning, as Harold Matthews performed his daily ritual of raising the American flag on his new, stronger flagpole, he would wave to the early arriving club members. They had developed their own morning routine, cleaning the street, maintaining their building, and ensuring the neighborhood stayed peaceful and well kept. The clubhouse itself had undergone a remarkable transformation. The walls, once covered in random posters, now displayed military memorabilia and photographs from different eras, from World War II to modern conflicts. Harold's D-Day unit photo held a place of honor near the entrance, alongside pictures of Tank and other members during their service years. Mrs. Thompson could hardly believe the change. Instead of late-night parties, the club now hosted weekly veterans support meetings. The sound of blaring music had been replaced by the buzz of conversation and occasional laughter as veterans of all ages gathered to share their stories and support one another. "You know what's funny, Martha?" Harold said one morning as she brought over her usual coffee and muffins. "Those boys needed the same thing I did after the war, a purpose and a brotherhood." The club's new mission had spread beyond Cedar Street. Every Sunday, a group of motorcycles would escort Harold to church, their engines respectfully quiet until they were well away from residential areas. The sight had become a local tradition, with people often stepping out of their houses to wave as the unusual procession passed by. Tank had proven to be an exceptional leader once he reconnected with his military values. Under his guidance, the club organized job fairs for veterans, provided mentoring for those struggling with civilian life, and even started a scholarship fund for veterans' children. The 3 members who had once vandalized Harold's property had become the club's most dedicated volunteers. Steve, who had taken down Harold's flagpole, now spent every Friday afternoon sitting with Harold, recording his war stories for the Veterans History Project. "My brother would be proud of this," he told Harold one day, his eyes bright with purpose. "We're keeping their memories alive." The neighborhood children, who had once been scared of the bikers, now visited the clubhouse regularly. The club members had set up a small library of military history books, and Harold would often sit there, sharing gentle stories about courage, honor, and friendship with young listeners. Tommy couldn't help but smile when he visited his grandfather now. Instead of finding him alone in his garden, you would often see Harold at the clubhouse, surrounded by younger veterans who listened intently to his wisdom and experience. The age gap had disappeared, replaced by the timeless bond of those who had served their country. On Veterans Day, 6 months after Harold's confrontation with the club, the Veterans Brotherhood Support Group organized a special ceremony. The mayor attended, along with General Martinez Jr. and representatives from Fort Bradley. The club was officially recognized for its outstanding community service and support of veterans. During the ceremony, Tank stood at the podium, his leather vest now bearing a new patch, "Veterans First." He spoke about transformation, about finding purpose, and about the wisdom of an elderly veteran who had seen past their rough exterior to the lost soldiers within. "Sometimes," Tank said, his voice carrying across the crowd, "it takes an old warrior to remind young warriors of who they really are. Mr. Matthews didn't just change our club. He helped us find our way back to ourselves." Harold sat in the front row, his uniform still fitting perfectly, his medals catching the sunlight. At 93, he had done more than stand up to a group of troublemakers. He had helped create a legacy that would continue long after he was gone. As the ceremony ended and the crowd mingled, Harold looked around at what this small act of courage had created. The once rowdy motorcycle club had become a beacon of hope for veterans in the community. The flagpole in his front yard stood taller than ever, and the garden below it bloomed with flowers tended by both old and young hands. Mrs. Thompson touched his arm gently. "You did it, Harold. You really did it." Harold smiled, watching as a young veteran walked into the clubhouse, looking nervous but hopeful. "No, Martha," he said softly. "We did it. Sometimes it just takes one person to remind others of who they truly are, and sometimes the biggest victories come not from fighting against people, but from fighting for them."